It's the morning of November 23rd, 1944, and Major John V. Crisp stands frozen at the edge of a muddy Belgian field, watching something that should be impossible. A massive B-17 flying fortress, 35,000 pounds of American steel and fury, has just plowed into the earth barely 50 yards from his anti-aircraft battery. The propellers have snapped off like matchsticks, spinning away across the field in a spray of mud and debris. Both wings slapped violently into the ground during the chaotic descent, their massive surfaces flexing under forces that should have torn them completely away from the fuselage. Three engines continue to rumble with an unsettling persistence, their drone filling the cold autumn air with mechanical menace that echoes across the Belgian countryside. The soldiers around him wait, rifles ready, expecting a rattled crew to stumble out at any moment, perhaps wounded, perhaps in shock, but alive and in need of immediate assistance. Emergency crews stand by with medical equipment prepared for the worst, ready to extract injured airmen from the twisted wreckage and rush them to field hospitals. But 15 minutes pass in tense silence, then 20. The drone of the engines continues its monotonous rhythm, and nobody emerges from the bomber. No hatches crack open, no voices call for help, no movement disturbs the eerie stillness surrounding the crashed aircraft. The hatch remains sealed, a closed door to a mystery that is becoming more disturbing with each passing second. The silence from inside the aircraft becomes more terrifying than any scream could ever be, more unsettling than the sound of combat or the cries of wounded men. Major Crisp exchanges glances with his men, seeing his own unease reflected in their faces. Something is very, very wrong with this picture. When he finally approaches the aircraft alone, searching for an entry point on the unfamiliar American bomber, his hands trembling slightly, despite years of combat experience, he has no idea he's about to discover one of the most inexplicable mysteries of the Second World War. What he will find inside this flying fortress will defy every principle of aviation, every law of physics he understands, and every assumption about what machines can and cannot do without human control guiding their actions. This is not a story about ghosts, despite what the legends will later claim. This is something far stranger, far more unsettling, far more real. This is the story of the Phantom Fortress, the bomber that flew itself home across miles of European sky, executed an emergency landing without a pilot's hands on the controls, and left behind only questions that would haunt investigators for decades to come. Questions that remain unanswered even today, 80 years after that impossible November morning. And it begins 6 hours earlier over the burning oil refineries of Merseburg, Germany, where a routine bombing mission is about to go catastrophically wrong, where decisions made in moments of panic will set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted or explained. The mission briefing at the 91st Bombardment Group base in East Anglia, England, had been routine that morning. Another strike against German oil production capabilities. Another formation of flying fortresses would climb into the grey November sky, cross the channel, penetrate deep into Nazi-controlled territory, and unleash their payloads on strategic targets that kept the Wehrmacht's war machine grinding forward. The target was Merseburg, home to some of the most heavily defended oil refineries in all of German-occupied Europe. The crews knew the risks intimately. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was weakened but far from defeated, and German anti-aircraft defenses had evolved into a science of calculated murder. The flak batteries protecting Merseburg's refineries were among the most concentrated in all of Europe, a gauntlet of 88mm guns that could fill the sky with lethal steel fragments in seconds. Bomber crews called these missions Running the Gauntlet, and the name was grimly appropriate. Statistics were grim, calculated with cold precision by intelligence officers. 1 in 4 bombers didn't return from missions over heavily defended German industrial centers. Some were shot down by flak, torn apart by exploding shells at 20,000 feet. Others fell to German fighters that dove through the formation, cannons blazing. Still others limped away from the target area, only to crash in the Channel or across the European countryside, their crews lost to the chaos of war. But this crew, like thousands before them, climbed aboard their B-17, performed their pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency, and roared down the runway into the morning twilight, engines thundering, the massive bomber clawing its way into the sky. The formation assembled over England, dozens of bombers slotting into their designated positions in a massive aerial armada that stretched for miles across the grey November sky. Fighter escorts took up their protective stations, P-51 Mustangs weaving above and around the bombers like sheepdogs guarding a flock. The course was set. Engines thundered as the fleet turned east, climbing to altitude, heading toward the continent and the firestorm that awaited them over Germany. The flight across the Channel proceeded without incident, the formation maintaining tight discipline as they crossed the grey waters below. Then came the transition over occupied territory, flying over France and Belgium, watching the landscape below transform from liberated Allied territory to the deadly expanse of Nazi-controlled Europe. The formation maintained altitude, climbing to 24,000 feet, where the air was thin and bitterly cold, where crew members relied on oxygen masks to breathe and electrically heated suits to survive temperatures that could drop to 40 degrees below zero. Then came the approach to the target area. The sky ahead began to darken, not with clouds, but with something far deadlier, flak. The German 88mm anti-aircraft guns opened up with their characteristic precision, filling the air with exploding steel fragments designed to shred aircraft and crew alike. The sky transformed into a nightmare landscape of black smoke bursts, each one a lethal cloud of shrapnel expanding at supersonic speed. Each burst represented a shell that had climbed 4 miles into the sky, detonated with split-second timing, and sent hundreds of jagged metal fragments screaming through the air at velocities that could punch through aluminum skin like paper. Bombers around them took hits almost immediately. Wings caught fire, trailing black smoke. Fuselages were perforated by hot metal, killing crew members instantly. Some aircraft broke formation, streaming smoke and flames, beginning their fatal descents toward the earth far below. The bombardiers hunched over their Norden bomb sites, trying to block out the chaos around them, calculating wind speed, altitude, and trajectory for the critical moment of release. The bomb run had to be steady, straight, and level, no matter what hell erupted around them. Then it happened to their aircraft. A flak shell detonated close enough to their B-17 that the entire airframe shuddered violently. The crew felt the impact through their bones, a massive concussion that rang through every rivet and frame of the bomber. The aircraft rang like a massive bell, struck by a hammer. Fragments tore through the fuselage with sounds like tearing fabric, amplified 1,000 times. The bomb release mechanism jammed, damaged by shrapnel. The bombardier tried desperately to release the payload, pressing the button again and again, but the racks wouldn't respond. They were carrying live ordnance over enemy territory with no way to drop it, flying with tons of high explosives that could detonate if they took another hit. The pilot made a decision that seemed reasonable in the moment, but would later be questioned endlessly. They would break formation temporarily, resolve the mechanical problem with the bomb racks, and then rejoin the group for the journey home. It was a calculated risk, one that crews sometimes had to take when mechanical failures threatened the entire aircraft and everyone aboard. But as they maneuvered away from the protective cover of the formation, separating from the other bombers that provided mutual defensive fire, German flak gunners on the ground saw an isolated target and adjusted their fire accordingly. More shells burst around them, closer now, the gunners concentrating their fire on the vulnerable lone bomber. The bomber took additional hits, shrapnel punching through the thin aluminum skin. One of the four engines suddenly sputtered, coughed black smoke, and died completely. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. Vibrations rattled through the aircraft as the asymmetric thrust pulled them into a yaw, the bomber wanting to turn toward the dead engine. The pilot compensated, fighting the controls, pushing hard on the rudder pedals to keep the aircraft flying straight, while the crew worked frantically to jettison the jammed bombs before the damaged racks gave way catastrophically and detonated the entire payload in a fireball that would vaporize the aircraft and everyone aboard. The flight engineer and bombardier worked together, trying manual releases, emergency procedures, anything to free the stuck ordnance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only minutes, the bombs released. They tumbled away into the sky below, falling toward the German countryside. The immediate threat was gone, but the bomber was now crippled, separated from its formation, and losing altitude over hostile territory. The pilot assessed their situation with the cold calculation that separated survivors from casualties in the brutal mathematics of aerial warfare. One engine completely dead, structural damage of unknown severity with holes torn in the fuselage and possibly compromised control surfaces. They were too far from England to make it back on the remaining power, especially while losing altitude steadily. German fighters could appear at any moment, drawn to a wounded bomber like sharks to blood in the water. A lone, damaged B-17 was easy prey for Luftwaffe pilots hunting for kills. The decision was made to alter course toward Brussels, Belgium, which had been liberated by Allied forces just months earlier in September. If they could maintain altitude and avoid further enemy contact, they might limp to friendly territory and execute an emergency landing at one of the newly established Allied airfields. It was their best chance, perhaps their only chance. The crew began the standard procedure for keeping a damaged bomber airborne. Everything non-essential was jettisoned. Ammunition belts for the 50 caliber machine guns went out the waste gun ports, tumbling away. Equipment, tools, anything with weight that wasn't absolutely necessary for survival went out the hatches. The bomber lightened incrementally with each item thrown overboard, struggling to maintain altitude as the pilot nursed the remaining three engines, carefully managing power settings to prevent additional failures that would doom them completely. They crossed back over the front lines, leaving German-held territory behind and entering the liberated zones where Allied forces controlled the ground. But the bomber continued to lose altitude despite every effort. The instruments told a story of progressive system failures, hydraulic pressure dropping gradually, fuel consumption increasing as the remaining engines strained under the increased load, working harder to compensate for the dead engine. The altimeter unwound steadily downward despite every effort to arrest the descent, the needle moving with inexorable persistence toward lower and lower altitudes. The pilot consulted with his crew over the intercom, his voice calm but tense. They were over Allied territory now, which meant they wouldn't be captured if they bailed out, but the bomber was clearly not going to make it to Brussels. The rate of descent was too steep. The remaining altitude was insufficient. The choice was becoming binary, stripped of all other options, stay with the aircraft and risk a catastrophic crash that would kill everyone aboard, or bail out while they still had sufficient altitude for their parachutes to deploy safely. This was the decision every bomber crew feared, the nightmare scenario they'd trained for but hoped never to face. The B-17 flying fortress had earned its legendary reputation for bringing crews home despite catastrophic damage. Stories circulated throughout the 8th Air Force of fortresses returning to base with entire sections shot away, engines destroyed, hydraulics failed, tail sections barely attached, yet still flying on sheer mechanical stubbornness. Crews developed an almost supernatural faith in the aircraft's resilience, a belief that the B-17 would always bring them home no matter what hell they flew through. But that same resilience could become a trap, convincing crews to stay with a doomed aircraft too long, gambling on the bomber's toughness until it was too late to bail out safely. The pilot looked at the altimeter one more time, watching the needle drop through 5,000 feet, then 4,000. The rate of descent was accelerating, not slowing. The bomber was dying, and it was taking them down with it. He made the call that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The decision that seemed like the only rational choice in that moment, but would later seem premature when they learned what happened next. They would set the aircraft to autopilot and abandon it. The autopilot system on a B-17 was a relatively simple mechanical device designed to maintain heading and altitude for short periods to relieve pilot fatigue during the long missions that could last 8 or 10 hours. It was not sophisticated by any measure. It could not navigate. It could not respond to changing conditions. It could not make decisions. It certainly could not execute a landing, but it would keep the aircraft flying in a straight line long enough for the crew to evacuate safely, or so the pilot believed. The crew prepared to bail out, gathering at their designated exit positions throughout the aircraft. The pilot trimmed the aircraft carefully, adjusting the control surfaces to achieve the most stable flight attitude possible. He engaged the autopilot, verified it was holding heading and altitude, at least momentarily, and gave the order to abandon the aircraft. One by one, the crew members jumped into the cold November air at several thousand feet altitude. The co-pilot went first, tumbling out into the slipstream. The navigator followed, clutching his maps and log even as he fell. The bombardier, the flight engineer, the radio operator, each of the gunners from their positions throughout the aircraft, each man tumbled away from the bomber, counted to 3 as they'd been trained, and pulled their ripcords. Parachutes blossomed above them as they drifted down toward the Belgian countryside below, watching their bomber continue flying without them. And the pilot, after ensuring every other man had evacuated, after walking through the empty bomber one last time to verify no one was left behind, took one last look around the cockpit of his aircraft, made a final adjustment to the controls, and jumped into the void. The B-17 flew on without them, empty, unmanned, its engines still running smoothly, its propellers still pulling it through the air with mechanical efficiency, its autopilot maintaining heading and altitude with simple mechanical precision. The bomber became a ghost in that moment, a flying machine without a soul, a ton of metal and fuel moving through the sky with no human consciousness guiding it. And then something inexplicable began to happen, something that no aviation engineer or pilot could have predicted. The abandoned B-17 should have crashed within minutes of the crew bailout, without a pilot to manage engine power settings, adjust trim for changing weight and balance, or compensate for the 1,000 small changes in aerodynamic forces that occur during flight. The aircraft should have entered a spiral, lost control, and plummeted into the Belgian countryside in a catastrophic impact that would have left nothing but a smoking crater. This is what happened to virtually every other pilotless aircraft in aviation history. Unmanned aircraft don't fly, they fall. But the Phantom Fortress didn't crash. Somehow, through a combination of the pilot's final trim adjustments, the autopilot settings, the specific configuration of the control surfaces, and sheer impossible coincidence, the bomber kept flying. The three remaining engines continued to run smoothly, their governors maintaining consistent RPM without human adjustment. The fuel mixture remained balanced through mechanical regulators. The aircraft maintained a shallow but steady descent, losing altitude gradually rather than falling from the sky in an uncontrolled plunge. It was as if the B-17 itself had decided to survive, as if some ghost hand was guiding it through the sky. Below, scattered across miles of Belgian countryside, the crew members landed safely in fields and forests. Local resistance fighters and Allied personnel found them, collected them, brought them to temporary shelters. They were alive, uninjured except for minor scrapes and bruises, and completely unaware that their abandoned bomber was still airborne, flying on a course that would take it directly toward a Royal Air Force anti-aircraft battery stationed outside the small Belgian town of Kortenberg. At the battery, British soldiers were conducting routine operations when one of the sentries spotted the approaching aircraft, a B-17 flying fortress, unmistakable in its distinctive profile, descending toward their position. And then someone noticed something strange. The landing gear was extended. The wheels were down. This was the configuration for landing, not for cruising flight. But who had lowered the gear? When had it been deployed? The crew had bailed out miles away. The aircraft was empty, yet there it came, gear down, flaps partially deployed, as if preparing for a controlled arrival at an airfield. The battery personnel assumed it was an emergency landing, a reasonable conclusion given the circumstances. Damaged bombers making unscheduled landings were not uncommon in the final year of the war. Allied aircraft limped back from missions over Germany constantly, often too damaged to make it all the way to their home bases, putting down at the first available field in liberated territory. The British soldiers prepared to receive a wounded aircraft and provide medical assistance to what they assumed would be an injured crew. Emergency procedures were initiated. Medical personnel stood ready. Fire crews positioned themselves for possible intervention if the aircraft caught fire during landing. Everyone watched as the B-17 descended lower and lower, approaching fast, too fast for a normal landing, but not impossibly fast. The approach was rough, uncontrolled, lacking the smooth precision of a trained pilot, but somehow the bomber was maintaining something resembling alignment with the field. It was coming in at the wrong angle, too steep, but it was coming in. The bomber cleared the battery's anti-aircraft guns by what witnesses later described as mere feet, an impossibly narrow margin. If the approach angle had been even slightly different, if the descent rate had been just a fraction steeper, the aircraft would have plowed directly into the gun emplacements, killing dozens of soldiers and detonating remaining ammunition in a massive explosion that would have devastated the entire position. But it cleared them, barely. The bomber hit the ground with tremendous force. The impact was violent, far harder than any controlled landing. The landing gear absorbed some of the initial shock, the struts compressing completely, but the aircraft bounced, lifted back into the air for a moment, then slammed down again even harder. The bomber skidded forward across the muddy field, tearing up earth, shedding debris. One wingtip struck the ground, causing the entire aircraft to pivot slightly, yawing to one side. The outboard propeller on that wing snapped off instantly, the blades shearing away and tumbling across the field. Both wings flexed dramatically under the stress, their tips slapping the ground repeatedly as the fuselage absorbed forces that would have torn a lesser aircraft into pieces. But the B-17 held together, living up to its reputation for structural integrity. The slide continued for dozens of yards, the screech of tortured metal echoing across the countryside. sparks flying as metal scraped against earth and stone. The remaining propellers dug into the ground, bending and breaking, and then gradually the laws of physics reasserted themselves. The friction of the soft ground and the drag of the damaged airframe arrested the bomber's forward momentum. The massive aircraft slowed, slower still, until finally it came to a complete stop, sitting crooked and wounded in the Belgian field. Three engines continued to run for several more seconds, their mechanical persistence eerie and unsettling. Then, one by one, they coughed and died. Fuel flow interrupted the sudden stop, having disrupted systems throughout the aircraft. Silence fell across the field, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the nervous voices of the British soldiers. And inside the bomber there was nothing, no crew calling for help, no movement, no sound, just empty seats, abandoned positions, and an eerie stillness that seemed to defy explanation. For 15 minutes, the British soldiers simply watched the motionless bomber from a distance, uncertain what to do. The aircraft had landed. It was clearly damaged, but why wasn't anyone getting out? Were they all dead? Were they trapped inside, injured and unable to move? The silence became increasingly disturbing, more ominous with each passing minute. Major John V. Crisp finally approached, cautiously, uncertain what he would find. The B-17 was an American aircraft, and Crisp was unfamiliar with its specific design and layout. He had seen flying fortresses before, of course, flying overhead in massive formations, but he had never been inside one. He circled the fuselage, looking for an entry point, half expecting to find the crew dead inside from combat injuries or crash trauma. Eventually, after several minutes of searching, he located the belly hatch beneath the fuselage, a small door that opened downward. He pulled it open and hoisted himself up into the bomber's interior, climbing awkwardly into the unknown. The interior was eerily pristine for an aircraft that had just crash-landed. No blood spatters, no bodies crumpled in corners, no sign of catastrophic damage or crew casualties. Crisp moved through the fuselage slowly, checking each station, each compartment, calling out but receiving no response. The bombardier's position in the nose was empty, the plexiglass intact, offering a clear view forward, but the Sperry bomb sight was still in place, undamaged, its protective cover neatly folded beside it. This was extraordinary, almost shocking. The Norden bomb sight was one of the most secret and valuable pieces of technology in the American arsenal, a precision instrument that had cost millions to develop. Crews were under the strictest orders to destroy the bomb sight before abandoning aircraft to prevent it from falling into enemy hands, yet here it sat, intact and functional, as if the crew had simply stepped away for a moment. At the navigator's desk, Crisp found more classified material. The code book, which contained daily authentication codes, recognition signals, and other sensitive information. Another piece of equipment that should have been destroyed or taken when the crew abandoned the aircraft. He flipped through it, finding entries in neat handwriting, documenting the mission. The last entry read simply, "Bad flak," nothing more. No indication of catastrophic damage, no record of system failures severe enough to warrant abandoning the aircraft, no explanation for why the crew had left. Crisp continued his search through the aircraft, his confusion deepening with each discovery. In the main fuselage, he found something that transformed the mystery into something approaching the impossible. Parachutes, a dozen of them, neatly wrapped, still clipped to their storage positions along the walls, completely unused. He counted them twice, unable to believe what he was seeing. If the crew had bailed out, where were their parachutes? He also found the crew's fur-lined flying jackets, essential equipment for high-altitude operations where temperatures routinely dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The jackets were folded or hanging casually, as if the crew had simply decided they didn't need them anymore. Half-eaten chocolate bars lay scattered on various surfaces, abandoned mid-meal, thermos containers with cold coffee, personal items. Everything suggested a crew that had been present just moments ago, but had somehow vanished without taking their essential equipment. The obvious conclusion was that the crew hadn't actually bailed out, but that conclusion made no sense because they clearly weren't aboard the aircraft now. So, where had they gone? Had they somehow survived the landing and wandered away? But the British soldiers had been watching continuously since the moment of impact, and no one had emerged. Crisp made his way back outside and examined the bomber's exterior more carefully, looking for the battle damage that would explain why the crew had abandoned it in the first place. He walked around the entire aircraft, studying every surface. Aside from the damage sustained during the violent landing, the snapped propellers, the bent wingtips, the stressed undercarriage, the scrapes and dents, there was remarkably little visible damage from combat, no gaping holes from flak shells, no evidence of fire damage, no missing sections of fuselage or wing, a few small punctures that could have been shrapnel, but nothing catastrophic. The aircraft looked like it had been perfectly capable of continued flight. Investigators from the United States 8th Air Force Service Command arrived within hours of being notified, racing from England to document this unprecedented event. They photographed everything, measured everything, analyzed every system they could access. What they found only deepened the mystery. All 4 engines were examined and found to be mechanically sound. The one engine the crew reported as knocked out by flak showed no evidence of catastrophic failure, no damage consistent with being hit by anti-aircraft fire. Mechanics concluded it had probably experienced a temporary fuel flow problem or vapor lock, but that it could have restarted, and apparently had restarted at some point after the crew bailed out. The fuel tank still contained enough aviation gasoline for another hour or more of flight. The bomber hadn't been running on fumes, it had plenty of fuel remaining. The hydraulic systems, while showing some damage from shrapnel, were still partially functional. The bomb racks, which the crew reported as jammed and severely damaged, appeared to have released their ordnance normally. There was no evidence of the severe mechanical problems the crew had described. Meanwhile, other investigators tracked down and interviewed the crew members who had been collected from various locations across the Belgian countryside and reunited in Brussels. Their story was consistent across all members. They had taken flak damage over the target. The bomb racks had jammed, creating a dangerous situation. They took additional hits after breaking formation to resolve the problem. One engine failed completely, causing severe vibration and control difficulties. They jettisoned the bombs manually and turned toward Brussels, but the aircraft continued to lose altitude at an alarming rate. Fearing they wouldn't make it to any airfield, believing the aircraft was doomed, they set the autopilot and bailed out. It was a reasonable decision based on their assessment of the situation in those desperate moments. Crew members described genuine fear, a sincere belief that the aircraft was about to crash and that bailing out was their only chance of survival. But that assessment didn't match the physical evidence. The bomber they described as crippled and dying had somehow flown for miles after they abandoned it, had somehow deployed its landing gear through unknown means, had somehow descended to a landing approach altitude, and had somehow crash-landed with enough control to remain largely intact rather than disintegrating on impact. How was any of that possible? The parachute discrepancy was eventually explained through investigation, though the explanation was almost as strange as the mystery itself. The crew had used their personal parachutes, the ones they wore on their bodies during flight, standard procedure. The dozen parachutes found aboard were spare emergency chutes stored in the aircraft for bailout situations where crew members might not have their personal chutes immediately accessible. Major Crisp, unfamiliar with American bomber procedures and equipment, hadn't known the difference, so the crew had indeed used parachutes. They hadn't jumped to certain death, but that still didn't explain the impossible flight and landing of the abandoned bomber. What do we make of the Phantom Fortress? How do we reconcile a story that seems to violate everything we understand about aviation, yet is documented in official military records, supported by eyewitness testimony from multiple sources and verified by physical evidence? The easy answer is to dismiss it as exaggeration or myth, to assume that details have been distorted over time, that the mystery is simply the result of incomplete information or dramatic embellishment by storytellers looking to add another ghost tale to the war's collection, but the evidence suggests otherwise. The official reports are remarkably consistent. The physical evidence was thoroughly documented by trained investigators. The aircraft existed and was examined in detail. The crew existed and was interviewed extensively. Major Crisp's testimony is detailed and sober, written in the dry language of military reports without the sensationalism that would suggest fabrication or exaggeration. Multiple witnesses observed the landing. Something genuinely anomalous occurred over Belgium that November day, something that remains unexplained despite decades of analysis and speculation. Perhaps the real mystery isn't how the Phantom Fortress landed itself, but what the incident reveals about the limits of our understanding. We build machines according to principles we believe we comprehend completely. We calculate tolerances, predict behaviors, design systems to operate within specific parameters and margin of safety. Engineers create detailed specifications, test pilots verify performance, and then occasionally something happens that falls outside those parameters that suggests our machines are more capable, more resilient, or simply more mysterious than we imagined. The B-17 Flying Fortress was, by any measure, an extraordinary aircraft even before the Phantom Fortress incident. Its crews called it the Flying Fortress, not just because of its defensive armament, but because it seemed nearly indestructible in the face of damage that would destroy other bombers. Stories abounded throughout the 8th Air Force of B-17s returning from missions with horrific damage, entire tail sections nearly severed, massive holes blown through wings and fuselage, multiple engines destroyed, yet still flying, still bringing their crews home. Was there something in the fundamental design of the aircraft, some emergent property of its aerodynamic and mechanical systems that made it capable of stable flight even without active human control? Some characteristic of its wing design, its center of gravity, its control surface ratios that created an inherent stability beyond what its engineers consciously intended? Or was the Phantom Fortress simply the luckiest aircraft in aviation history, the beneficiary of a probability so remote it might never occur again in the entire future of human flight? A perfect storm of coincidences, each one individually unlikely but not impossible, that combined to produce an outcome that appears miraculous. We may never know with certainty. The men who could have provided more detailed testimony are gone now, veterans of a war fought 8 decades ago. The aircraft itself was dismantled for parts and scrapped decades ago, its components scattered or melted down. The investigation files exist in archives, but they provide descriptions, not explanations. All that remains is the story and the uncomfortable questions it raises about the machines we create and the mysteries that persist even in our age of technical sophistication and scientific certainty. But perhaps that's fitting for a story from World War II, a conflict full of moments that defy easy explanation, events that seem to transcend the merely physical and enter the realm of the inexplicable. The soldier who survives when everyone around him falls, the bullet that misses by an inch when it should have been fatal, The aircraft that refuses to die when all logic says it should crash. These are the stories that haunt veterans long after the guns have fallen silent, the tales they tell in quiet voices to those who will listen and believe. The Phantom Fortress is one of those stories destined to be told and retold as long as people remember the Second World War. A bomber that flew without a crew, a machine that seemed, for one impossible afternoon, to possess something approaching will or consciousness. An event that occurred, was witnessed, was documented, yet remains inexplicable despite our best efforts to understand it. And on quiet November days when the light is dim and the clouds hang low over Belgian fields, you might imagine that ghost bomber still out there somewhere in the grey sky, flying its eternal mission, engines rumbling steadily, propellers turning, cockpit empty, heading for a destination it will never reach, a phantom forever searching for a crew that will never return to guide it home.